Dusty, are you in and live?
I'm good.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sweet. Thank you all.
Okay, are you ready to admit people?
Let's rock and roll. Thank you, Katie. And thank you for recording, Michael. All right. Are we, let's see, I see 5 in here. Have we admitted?
Yep, we've got 21 people in the meeting.
Okay, cool. Welcome everyone. Okay, now I can see everybody. Cool. Welcome everyone to our office hours. I'll introduce myself quickly. Nate Hansen, Financial Performance Manager, new to the SPCSA. Had a little bit of tenure at NDE a number of years ago, overseeing the distributed school account. And I'm thrilled to be here. So again, we're jumping into busy season with budgets. We want to use our time wisely today. So just a quick intro. I want to let everybody know that the final budget template that we sent out yesterday with yesterday's date 5/14 is the final budget template that will be used for this year. So even if NDE sends out some other template, this is the final one to use. If you have any questions, please contact us. The directions for completing that task, including sending to NDE and LCB, are included in Epicenter. And then a quick heads up before we get started. We have compiled questions that have been posed. We have not compiled all the responses to those yet. I'm sure we're going to run through a bunch of those today, but we will be drafting an FAQ to post on our website. We anticipate that will be live later today with what we have answers to so far, and we'll be updating that as soon as possible as we proceed. So with that, again, welcome all, and I'll hand it over to Dusty. We're going to do a quick overview of sort of questions and themes that he has noticed as our subject matter expert to date. And then we'll jump back in. I will do a tour through the new workbook and we can field questions as we move along. And then we can wrap it up with any final questions.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nate.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Dusty Casey. Currently, I'm contracting with the SPCSA. I was a co-founder of Oasis Academy Charter School in Fallon, Nevada. I was the CFO there for about 10 years, and I have been on an appointed member of the Commission on School Funding since the beginning, since 2019, since that commission started. So that commission, for those of you who don't know, was in charge of monitoring and implementing the PCFP funding formula that was created by SB 543 in that session. So we went through all the budgets, definitely some common themes throughout the budgets with this Department of Taxation templates. And we tried to note as many of those things that we saw as possible. Some common themes are the use of funds. Some schools have as many as 24 funds they're listed. Other common themes were missing transfers between funds. So we're happy to field questions across the board about this workbook, about where you should code things, or and what type of transfers. There's some questions about debt and so on and so forth. So happy to walk through. I think probably the order we will go in is we'll just open these up. Nate or Michael, I'm not sure who's going to share their screen, but we can go tab by tab and we can just open up the floor to any questions if that works for everybody.
I'll share my screen if you're ready for us to jump into that, Dusty.
Yeah, I think we can jump in. Are there any preliminary questions from anybody before we get started?
I have a question.
Yep.
Yes, hi, Farah Jamshed representing Legacy Traditional Schools. I have a question. In the Epicenter task that was shared, it says that you can either use the attached form or the one that you submitted for the tentative budget, but you're saying that we should be only using the final budget template. Is that correct?
That's correct. We'll be updating the Epicenter task, but this final template we want Number one, this will help avoid some errors that we discovered. It streamlines a few things. It locks out some things that aren't applicable to charters. So we've adapted it to make it easier for all of us to use on the charter side. And this will be the final form. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the goal, it's a great question. The goal for this was to get charters to use a consistent format that wasn't customized to districts. So that when they switched us over to this Department of Taxation form, that form is heavily skewed towards districts because that's the form they've been using for a long time. Each district customizes that form. There's a lot of information in there about property tax dollars and debt service and things that are related to districts that don't apply to charters. And so we went through there and really tried to customize this to where it better fits all the charter schools and everybody's using a consistent format.
Any other questions before we jump in, or I will start sharing and we can walk through. Go for it, Robert.
I actually can't use the chat. I don't know why maybe that's why you're not getting a lot of questions.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have chat capability going generally, Michael? Are you aware?
Chat should be working. Let me double check that.
Okay. If you want to check on that on the side. Are there any other questions before we jump into the workbook? All right, let's dive in.
So we would recommend the order to fill this workbook out is start with Schedule B1. Start with Schedule B1 with enrollment, FTEs for your employees, enter your funding estimates per pupil, and enter your weighted funding. That should be your baseline. This is what's called your PCFP funds, and that will roll back up to Schedule 1. So if you start on Schedule B1, make sure you have your enrollment in there. This will all calculate, and this is what actually comes out of the state education fund. So on Schedule 1, where it talks about what funds you have that you're receiving from the state education fund, it should come from tab B1. It also, B1 should match your revenue tabs on Schedule BB5, which we'll get to in a minute. One thing you'll notice is we blocked out auxiliary transportation and special transportation. Some of you are receiving transportation dollars, but that's part of the governor's special allocation from last session and is not part of the general PCFP funding. So this for districts is what they get as part of the state education that comes out of the state education account. Charters are not eligible for that. They were removed from that last session. And so that's why the governor did a special appropriation, and that would actually be treated as a state grant. So that you should not have transportation dollars if you're getting it in this section. So that's why we blocked that out. But this will total your state education fund. You'll notice that on line 42, local special education funding, there's a lot of, it looks like a lot of confusion around local SPED dollars, and rightly so. Local SPED is confusing. Local special education dollars are simply a carve out of the general fund. They are not a separate appropriation of funding. Essentially, the state education base funding pot is created, and then local special education dollars are pulled from that pot and turned around and given back to schools. And so it is technically part of your base funding, and that is why we combined it up to there. And that you will get, for those schools who are getting local special education dollars, it should match your last 2 years of 387 general fund transfers over to your special education fund to cover your deficit. So you would combine those two transfers from each 387 report and divide it by 2, and that's what you would get each of the next 2 years in the biennium. So it is part of your total general fund dollars coming from the PCFP, and that's why we moved it up there. The other 3 that we call weighted funding, is ELL, gifted and talented, at risk. Those are funds 206, 207, 208, and those are broken out below. So that combined total goes down to the bottom in your total funding for state education fund. So are there any questions on this tab?
Let's see, it looks like Kristen has a question about food service revenue being reported on this tab.
Yes. So if you are getting food service revenue, you would report that. I don't know how that shows up when it comes to the schools. So Kristen, maybe you'll know that because at Oasis, we did not have food service dollars. Is there a state portion and a federal portion? Obviously, a lot of that comes from the USDA, or does it come as a lump sum to you?
Yeah, it comes as federal. It comes as a lump sum, and it's recorded as federal under Project Grant 802.
Okay, there is a small state portion, and only the state portion would go here. So if you are not getting a state portion, it's very small. It's like dollars per kid compared, the rest is made up. So a lot of districts, they might get, for example, I've heard a number like $25 a kid or something for the year in state funding. That's the only portion I believe that would go here. Federal dollars would not.
Any other questions, or are you ready to move on to BB5? Moving on.
Okay, so after B1, we would recommend that you go start with your revenue and then go through your expenditure tabs. So BB5, again, just revenue. There were some people populating some functions that really aren't applicable. And so we did go ahead and remove those, such as, I believe it was 1990, which was kind of a catch-all, but it's really for special things related to districts that didn't apply. So if you're getting some local dollars, you're not sure where to put them, they should probably go to function code, or excuse me, revenue code 1920. But other than that, the only other thing I saw in here that we did fix was from the old charter tab, there was a line item for charter sponsorship fees. And that really shouldn't be broken out. That's mostly to record for districts for who were sponsoring charter schools that got sponsoring revenue. So we removed that. So in your PCFP funding, line 32, 3110, PCFP adjusted base funding, that should match Schedule B1. That should be the total of your base funding. Same with ELL, at risk, gifted and talented, and local SPED 3115. Those numbers should all match Schedule B1. Any questions on BB5?
All right, moving on to BB6.
Okay, BB6, this is really your totals and other financing sources. So other financing sources, if you are going to be getting some sort of long-term debt in this upcoming school year, you would record that first on Schedule C1, which is your debt schedule, and then you would record that revenue here in 5100. So 5110, 5120, if you have new debt. If not, that stays blank. The other big area where a lot of schools are missing are your funds transfers in. This would come directly from Schedule T and should be the total of all transfers in. And we'll talk about Schedule T here in a second after we get through the expenditure tabs. But let's say you're transferring to 3 different funds. You're transferring from your general fund over to Fund 250, which is special education, ELL, and at risk to cover deficits. The total of those transfers into those other funds would go here in 5200. And so that would go in that line item. And then finally, the other thing we saw missed a lot, opening fund balance. This had some verbiage that was specific to districts and some of their net proceeds from minerals, which charter schools do not get. Your opening fund balance is made up of two portions, a reserve, or what some people call restricted, and an unreserved or an unrestricted. There's two line items for you to list that. If your board has restricted a portion of your reserves coming into the year, let's say, for example, at Oasis Academy, our board had restricted a certain amount of money because we were self-funded for unemployment. So we had a set aside for that, and the board actually restricted an amount for that. That number would go in the restricted box. The balance of the rest of the reserves would go in the unrestricted, and that total would make up your total opening fund balance. And that really should match your prior year's ending fund balance from Schedule BB 14A and from your audit. Not from your governmental wide, but from your fund basis. So that really should tie out back to your last year's audited ending fund balance should be that total. So if you don't have a restricted amount, just put the total of your reserve in the unrestricted, and then that cell will total it. And then your total resources are calculated as total revenue plus any other financing sources, plus your opening fund balance. That makes up the total resources you have going into the school year. Any questions on this schedule, BB6?
All right, moving on. BB7.
Okay, so BB7 through BB14 are really just a schedule of all your expenditures. It's by program. This is how the Department of Taxation and NDE has set this up. BB7, we tried to clarify it a little bit to make it for what charters are mostly using. And so you have regular programs. We did see some schools putting quite a bit of costs in function code 2900 throughout various programs. I did not realize that they were missing the function codes 2100 and 2200 for things like guidance counselors and nurses that might be working within those programs. The old charter school and university template did have those in there. So we were able to catch that and we fixed that. So you really shouldn't be using function code 2900 for anything. You should be able to code all your expenses to one of those other function categories. So we made sure to put that in. So going through this, just make sure you have the right program codes. If we go to schedule BB8, this is where all your special education costs would go in BB8. And Nate, we'll work through these BB schedules and then take any questions on the BB schedules in general, if that works. Okay. BB8 is really just, for most people, is just special education. That's where all your special education costs will go. Please remember to record all of your special education costs regardless of the revenue you are getting. I'm still seeing this on the budgets. It is very important, and charter schools are getting significantly less amount of special education funding compared to districts, both in the state dollars and what they're getting back in local sped. I can tell you right now, charter schools are getting less than half of what districts are getting in that local special education carve out. And it's specifically related to how schools are recording their special education costs and reporting them on the 387. So it's very important that if you have IAs or teachers who are splitting duty, part-time in general education, part-time in special education, that you are recording their salaries and benefits in special education. If you deficit spend, then you're just like every other district and the vast majority of schools who are spending 2 to 3 times as much in special education as they actually get in revenue from state sped dollars and Part B dollars. So please make sure, I cannot emphasize this enough in special education, that you are capturing all your costs. So if you are a back office service provider, please ask your school leaders if they are splitting any positions or anything like that. Or if you're a school leader, please make sure you're reporting to your back office service provider all your staff that are spending time in special education and supplies in special education et cetera, and make sure those are getting cost towards that, because many of you are probably going to see in funding estimates that your local sped got cut or outright removed, and it's going to be a direct reflection of your 387 reporting. So please make sure you're coding those dollars correctly.
I just want to
Nate,
jump in.
go ahead,
Yeah,
Nate.
I just wanted to say the same thing. We are going to be hammering on this. If you are not recording every dollar that you are spending on SPED, you are leaving money on the table. And I don't know of anyone that wants to leave money on the table. So we're going to be hammering on this. These things need to be included. It's not money out of our pocket per se, it's money out of your pocket. So we want to make sure we get these included in 387s. Budgeting from the beginning like this will help you do that. All right, ready for the next one, Dusty? BB9?
We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
So honors uses 2400 and 2500. Were those added where applicable?
Yes, so 2400 is support services school administration. It's school-wide administration. That should really go in program 000, undistributed. It's kind of like in a private company, general overhead. Same with function 2300, which is district-wide stuff. And everybody, you need to remember that these chart of accounts were created before charter schools, right? So they're districts. Districts have a district office, then they have their school level administration, okay? So 2300 is really like district-wide stuff. 2400 is school level admin, 2500 are central services. All of that applies to your entire school, no one specific program. So while you might use 2100 and 2200 within a program, let's say a counselor is teaching something, teaching a class to your students, working directly within program 100 or doing some special education work. So you might program that in 200 and 2100 student support. Maybe you have a nurse that teaches a health class or something like that. Those are just some examples. Those could get coded within a program. You really shouldn't have anything, and it says in the NDE chart of accounts like 2400 is generally used with your undistributed program, meaning it's school-wide stuff that can't necessarily be cost to any specific one program.
And just to clarify, those school-wide codes are found on a schedule that we haven't looked at yet, right, Dusty?
Correct. We're getting to that. Yeah.
Okay. And then Christina asked on schedule BB8, where do you put the function codes that are not on that tab for special education?
I'm not sure what function codes those would be unless they were 2400 and 2500 that I was just talking about, but I'm not sure what other function codes, because 2300 on, other than 2700 student transportation, are around school administration. That are generally school-wide. So
Christina, can you tell us what some of those function codes that you're referencing might be?
Yeah, they are some of those other function codes that Dusty just mentioned, because the school does split a portion of their costs with special education. And in the previous template, the budget template, it had say 2100 to 2600. So we could split those costs. So now you're saying they go on a different tab within the quote unquote general fund.
Well, not a really general fund, because it would be yeah. So are you saying you have like in a part of your administration you're costing to special education? Is that what I'm gathering?
Correct.
Are they working in I guess I would say then if part of those administrators are working in a student support capacity or an instruction support capacity, you would code them to 2100 or 2200, because I don't really know. That's probably the capacity they're working in. So in my opinion, you would probably cost them to like 2200 instruction staff support, because that's probably what they're doing, is supporting the SPED instruction staff. Or if they are doing supporting students directly, then you would code it there.
It's more generalized, and where, say, an executive director has to attend IEP meetings, or they're putting a portion of their time into overseeing the special ed program as well.
Okay, I see. Well, then in that case, then it's subjective. So yeah, you could then potentially, if that's how you would prefer to code it, 2,400. The bigger thing is that it's going into the special education program. So I would say then that for the schools who want to do that, I guess it would make sense then to put 2,400. It doesn't really fit the description, because obviously school principals work to support all programs. That's why you code them to the undistributed, because admin staff work to support program 100, program 200, program 400s. They work to support everybody, and you wouldn't cost a portion of them out to every other single program either. Does that make sense?
Understood. But again, splitting
Yeah.
costs to maximize the special education dollars, we've used a portion of it. So just
Okay.
wanted guidance on it and where we needed to put it.
Okay. In my opinion, it would stay in 2,400 and undistributed. Or if they were working in a capacity, then, because again, to my point, if you did it for this program, why wouldn't you then cost that same administrator out to program 100 also, or program 400, which is ELL and at risk, even if they attend, some sort of training or meeting around ELL or at risk. So in my opinion, it's a similar scenario. And that's what program 000 is for. And you do want to be careful on special education, because obviously there's maintenance of effort. And so I want to be clear, I'm not advocating throwing extra dollars coding to your special education program, because that technically restricts your money for the following year because of maintenance of effort. So you want to be careful about what you code, but you want to capture all your costs accurately. So let's get through those BB schedules. It's an interesting question. Let me think about it, because it is subjective. So is that all of them, Katie, on that?
Yes. We did get some follow-up, some potential discrepancies on the 000 program, but we can, I think, maybe mention that when we get to that tab.
Okay. Okay, Schedule BB9. I saw a lot of schools missing this tab. The 400 programs includes ELL, GATE, and at risk. And so if you're running those programs, you should have costs here. When the PCFP came out, it was a requirement that once you receive these dollars, if you're running these programs, that you open a new fund for ELL at risk, even if they're insignificant, meaning you're getting a very small amount of money for them in ELL or at risk, you technically should be operating funds 206 for ELL, 208 for at risk, and 207 for GATE. The vast majority of charters are not operating GATE programs, but all of those programs are in this 400, and you would summarize those into this section here. So please make sure, if you do have at-risk costs, ELL costs, etc., that you are capturing all of those costs here on this Schedule BB9. And then, of course, these summer school sections are just any summer school directly related to those special programs. So you have summer school for your general education population, you have summer school for special education, and then you have summer school for these special programs as well. Okay, BB10, I don't think anybody filled these out. We didn't have any schools who are running adult ed programs, community service programs. Let's go to BB11. co-curricular programs. If you're running athletics programs, you have a middle school where you're running athletics, or you have school sanctioned other clubs such as FFA, student council, those sorts of things. That there was a question on our that we got from a school about what exactly we code here. This is all after. Co-curricular is generally after school type activities, not necessarily for programs that you might be running during the school day that are part of electives, let's say, or something. So, you know, FFA's after school programs, student council after school programs, those are good examples of 910. And then of course, anything with sports is 920.
We have a question on this. Do you put Fund 279 here or only Fund 100?
So all of your funds are going to go on these BB schedules. They're broken out by program, not necessarily fund. So yes, so your federal expenditures go on here. Your state sped, which is Fund 250, that goes in program 200. Those expenditures, all of your expenditures should be captured on these BB tabs in the correct program and function. Don't know what Fund 279 is specifically because I don't see Fund 279 on my NDE chart of accounts. Michelle, can you in the chat list what Fund 279 is?
SGF.
What's SGF? I'm sorry.
The Student Activities Fund?
Oh, that's actually, well, I mean, according to, no, you do not. Student activities funds are separate. Student activities funds technically is Fund 900, according to the NDE chart of accounts when you look at the funds tab. So student activities, how NDE lists it, are those for those funds that the school is just the bank for. That those clubs, let's say, they operate their own funds and you're just the bank, you keep track of the ledgers, but they have their own activities. You actually don't report those types of things in your budget. You also don't report them in your 387. Your auditor will probably note them in the audits, but for those type of clubs who are after school clubs that aren't really school sanctioned, but are school affiliated, maybe you have an after school robotics club and they have their own funds that they fundraise for, those sorts of things. They keep track of their own stuff and you're just a bank. That's technically Fund 900, which they're also called agency funds, which is really where the school is technically just acting as the bank for those. But your school sanctioned activities such as sports, maybe you have a debate team that goes and competes against other schools where you might actually transport kids to, they're allowed to miss school for, those sorts of things that are co-curricular in nature, that are part of your educational program, but are after school, those go on these programs here. And for the vast majority, those are just general fund activities, co-curricular. Okay, BB12.
There was one more question from Michelle Raymer. Michelle, do you want to pose that question?
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify on that. So we do use 279, which is on the chart of accounts, as a student activities fund. I know there's a 900 and there's a 279, there's both. But my question comes back to just making sure, so anything that's on the 279 or 900 does not, no revenue, no expenses, no transfers, nothing that's coded to the 279 should show up on this budget template. Is what you said.
If they fit the description of, and I apologize, Michelle, I'm looking at the October 2023 chart of accounts and I don't. Okay, actually, I do see it. So I apologize. Not otherwise categorized as 900. Yeah, neither of those would go on your budget. They're totally separate funds that you're keeping track of, but aren't really part of your educational activities, for lack of a better term.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to verify.
Yeah. And I know a lot of schools, even at our school, like the basketball team had a club account they would fundraise for and stuff, FFA had a club account that they would raise money for. They would do various activities, have a dinner, do some sort of fundraising to help support their activities. That was totally separate and not part of the school budget. They just kept track of that, and we were the custodian of those funds. The FFA program, where we sent kids to compete, of course, if we paid an instructor a stipend or something to advise that club, then that would go in your budget. But those activities funds, no, they would not go on this or on your 387. Okay. Okay, so BB13. So this is where we get into all the undistributed expenditures that are really school-wide or district-wide, all your support stuff. So, nurses who are working for the whole school, your IT people, obviously your central office staff, all those sorts of things, maintenance. For the most part, I saw this looked good. It did appear some schools were missing some of this. I can't think of a reason why a school wouldn't have costs to, let's say, function 2400, because every school has a central office that works for the whole school. So I would assume, and that's really what this undistributed program is for. This undistributed 000 program with all these functions are for those, let's call, general overhead things, to use a private business terminology. That's where all of this sort of stuff goes, is in these functions. So counselors who just working across all your programs, et cetera, those costs go throughout these schedules, which I believe are BB13. Then we get into BB14, which are your 4,000s, or BB13, I guess, is your food service. Nate, if you'll go to BB13 real quick, those of you who
Yep.
had food service, obviously that would go here. Enterprise activities is something I saw in a handful of schools, and it was unclear of whether they're operating separate funds or if they actually have enterprise operations. Enterprise operations are really those programs or operations where the intent is to make a profit, is to raise money. So let's say you're running a school store where you're selling stuff, you're generating revenue, and that's an activity that your school runs. That could be considered an enterprise operation if the dollars are significant enough. Things like catering programs. Some school districts have construction programs where they build and sell houses. Things like that are where the intent is to sell a product or a service like a private business would. So if you're operating something like that, enterprise 3,200 operations would be where it goes. And if the dollars are significant enough to warrant opening a separate fiscal fund, maybe you do that. I don't know a lot of charters. I know, like at our school, we operated a school store and it just stayed within our general fund. But their argument could be you could technically open a separate fiscal fund if the dollars were significant enough and your board felt it warranted to actually track that in a separate fiscal fund. Otherwise, you would just leave it as part of your general fund. And regardless, you would still report it here. Food service, of course, that's all your food program costs go to 3,100 right there. Okay, schedule BB14. This is all your building acquisition, construction, land acquisition, et cetera.
Sorry, before
ahead.
you go into this one, can we go back to BB12?
Sure.
Andy, would you mind coming on and kind of talking about the discrepancy you mentioned in the school nomics direction with breaking out the full-time school admin?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. So what we've been directed by Schoolnomics on a couple of different iterations of, them giving us review is we've never used that program, the 000 program. So they've always had us separate everything. Like, my contract, for example, supports 3 separate programs. And so my contract, we book everything that has to do with my contract into all 3 of those separate programs. And that's the guidance that they have given us on that. So, I had mentioned in my emails, like, I'm just a little bit concerned that we're going to end up missing several expenditures if we don't have the opportunity to provide numbers for each of those functions in the programs that we are splitting into.
So that's interesting, Andy, because I mean, we got feedback too from Schoolnomics and various things, mostly around federal funds. The thing to remember about Schoolnomics is they're collecting data across all states and compiling to comply with federal requirements. And so just because you change something in how you code to fit the Schoolnomics doesn't necessarily mean that that's how you have to account for it. For example, we didn't have a separate federal fund for federal grants. The revenue was generally not significant compared to our general revenue, so we never operated Fund 280. Those federal funds, we coded them to federal funds, project grant codes and program codes, but not with a separate fiscal fund. So our board never authorized a separate federal fund. However, when we would report to Schoolnomics, they would make us use, instead of Fund 100, Fund 280, I believe, is for federal funds for that. I never had to adjust program 000 with those function codes to split an administrator out to program 100 or 200 or 300. So that's interesting feedback, because that was never my experience. Maybe some of you did have that. But that's, if that was the case and we were required to do that, there would be no undistributed program. Everything would have to be cost out to another program, or you would have to break everybody out in your central office, your counselors, everything, nurses, you would have to allocate a portion of them to every program. That's generally not how the accounting works in Nevada. Under the Nevada Department of Education. So, if Schoolnomics is making you do something, I would say that's, in my opinion, I would say that could be separate from what you actually do and do in accordance with NDE and their chart of accounts.
And we can move this conversation, offline if it doesn't apply to people. But I do want to say, so we have been, when we work with Schoolnomics, they will give us the feedback. They then require us to resubmit to them a trial balance showing that we've made those changes. So how we've been accounting for things in all of our records is in line with those directions that they give us, because they require that we turn that trial balance back in. So if there's a better way for us to be doing that, I'm more than willing to hear that, and not having to split everything out would make everybody's life easier. So I'd like to explore that more, but if it doesn't apply to anybody else, I can do that in just a one-on-one.
And I'm happy, Andy, to do that in a one-on-one. I could show you what we did at Oasis, and I'm happy to do that. So we could, if you want to reach out to Nate after this meeting, we can set something up.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Great question, though.
Okay, that's it. So you can keep going.
Okay, so BB12, BB13, BB14, these are all part of your 000 undistributed programs. And again, these are meant to be school-wide type stuff. So in these 4,000s, I will say on Schedule 14, if you buy a piece of land, let's say you buy a lot for $200,000, or you buy a building for $1 million, whatever it is, the total price of that takes place in the school year goes on this schedule. Please remember that these schedules, so this budget schedule is not based on governmental wide accounting. It's based on fund accounting. So even if you get debt, acquire debt to buy or to do a capital improvement or make a capital investment, such as buy a piece of property, the full purchase price of that goes on this schedule. It doesn't just hit a balance sheet and then depreciation only hits this schedule. The full purchase price of it, based on fund accounting, hits this schedule. So if you bought a $5 million piece of property, $5 million would go on either land acquisition, or if it had a building on it, then it would go to 4,500 building acquisition and construction. If you hire a contractor to do a remodel in your school and that remodel's $500,000 and that includes materials and labor, then that would go under building improvements, and it would be the full contract amount would go under building improvements, probably under purchase service. I think it's like 450 is the object code if you hire a contractor that does all that. So please make sure you're capturing the full cost of that. If it's a project that's spanning multiple years, maybe you have a construction project that's going multiple years, then you would do your best to capture the construction in progress, as it's called. So if you figure you're going to complete 3/4 of it this year and 1/4 of it in the following year, you would put 3/4 of the price in this year and 1/4 of it in the following year based on how you're going to pay it out. So just a quick note on those 4,000 schedules. Okay, BB 14A. So this was missing. The line item 5,000 was missing. It was on the old Charter University template. It wasn't on this one. So we added it back in. So 5,000, line 5,000, debt service, principal, and interest, that should match the total from your Schedule C1 that we'll go to in a minute. Principal and interest, that total that you're going to write checks for the year should go in that line 5,000. 6,200 funds transfer out. Again, this will match Schedule T. So in the example I used earlier, all those general fund transfers to your other funds like ELL, SPED, at risk, whatever, the total of those that are being transferred out would go here. So they essentially balance each other out. They become a resource for those funds and an expenditure for your general fund in that example. So those totals should match on both your revenue, your resource side, and your expenditure side. Contingency. The only requirement on contingency is you cannot set aside more than 3% of your total program expenditures. And technically you can't count debt service in that. So it would be net of debt service, but you can set aside up to 3% contingency of your total expenditures. It's definitely a best practice. Your board might choose to do only 1%, 2%. The vast majority of schools I'm seeing are not putting anything in contingency. Please remember that contingency, if you put that in your budget, will help you in case of an emergency. A pipe breaks and you need to fix something that wasn't budgeted for. Maybe in the middle of the year, you get a student enrolled with severe needs, critical needs, where you got to hire a one-on-one aide that you didn't budget for. And you're technically, as an administrator, aren't allowed to spend really outside of your approved budget, your board approved budget. Your board can release contingency for emergency type situations. So that's really what the contingency is there for. You can choose not to put it in. I would definitely say, I would argue, again, in my opinion, that it is definitely a best practice to put that contingency in. If you don't use it at the end of the year, it just goes back into your ending fund balance and gets captured. So if you do that, then your total expenditure line would include contingency. So line 15 would include all of that, including debt service. So your net, which would be your total resources from Schedule BB6, the total resources line, not total revenue, but your total resources, which includes opening fund balance, subtracting your total expenditures should leave you with your ending fund. And your ending fund again is broken up between your unrestricted and your restricted. So you would input, if your board just maintains a restricted amount of reserves, you would just input that again. And then the balance left over would go to unrestricted, and the combination of those two would make your total ending fund balance. The last line is total applications. Total applications should essentially match your total resources. And so there's a check line because your total application includes your ending fund balance. Therefore, it would be the cumulative effect of matching your total resources. So if all of this adds up correctly, your total applications will match your total resources from Schedule BB6. Okay. Before we go any further, let's see if there's any other questions on any of the BB tabs. And Nate or Katie or Michael, jump in, please.
I want to make a brief note about the mechanics of the contingency calculation. We did update this. It was originally coded to essentially hard retain 3% contingency. The way we've set it up now is that it cannot exceed 3%. If you are implementing any contingency fund, input that here, and that would be reflected in your final. So we know this is a little bit awkward because it's labeled tentative, but input it here in this darker yellow, and that will be reflected. It just cannot exceed the 3%. So minor mechanical note.
And many of you probably have in your board financial policies a policy about contingency. So if you haven't pulled that out and dusted it off in a while, you might look at that, because technically if your board has approved a financial policy, as our board did, it's spelled out we had to set aside 3% contingency in every budget. You may double check that and make sure that that's not in there somewhere in your board approved financial policies.
Yeah, as a general best practice, we do advise you to budget some contingency.
Okay,
Jesse,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Katie.
This is not a question that was asked, but what happens if you budget for 3% contingency and then you don't use that money?
It just goes, it's the same as if your revenues come in higher than your expenditures or expenditures come in less. It just becomes part of your net balance and goes into your ending fund balance. So at the end of the year, it just becomes money you didn't spend. Same as if you saved in program 100 because you hired a cheaper teacher than you budgeted for and you didn't spend quite as much money. It's just leftover money you didn't spend. And when your audit's completed, your opening fund balance will just be bigger than what you had originally budgeted for because you didn't spend it. So it's just an unspent line item in your budget.
Okay, and then Monica asked if the contingency has to be board approved.
Well, again, it would be approved as part of your budget. So no, you as administrators present your budget to the board, right? And some of you might have finance committees or various other committees that review budgets, and then your board ultimately approves it. So if you put a line item in there in contingency and your board sees that and your board approves it, then it becomes part of your budget. Just please make sure though that you do check, because in general, the practice was, at least for us, and I know for other schools when we first opened, because that's kind of how we learned, was contingency. You could only be spent if the board released it. And that's really an NRS. So remember, at the school level, administrators, you might be able to move money around from function code to function code. But if you want to take money from program 100 or definitely transfer money from one fund to another, you need board approval for that. And that's probably in your financial policies as well.
And then still going on contingency, Nick said some schools are including a contingency in their enrollment projections.
What does that mean exactly?
Nick, are you able to help provide some clarity on your question there?
Yeah, like for example, the budget is like 5,000 enrollment, but we are putting contingency like 3%, and we are budgeting like 4,800 students.
That's up to you. I mean, how your board chooses to build in, let's say, a buffer to be conservative in your budget, then absolutely. You might be able to do that. But remember, if you need to spend money the revenue doesn't really help you. So if your enrollment comes in higher, that's fine. But if you don't have a line item in your budget where you need to go spend $100,000 for something that's not in your line items of expenditures,
Yeah.
technically you can't really go spend it, right? So that's having that expenditure in there in contingency, then you're just growing your expenditures to allow some room in there. And then again, depending on your board financial policies, how that contingency can be spent or released, I just know for us, it had to be board approved to release contingency. And I think we only did it once maybe in the 15 years I was at that school. But, the administrators came to a board meeting and said, hey, we need to release X amount of this for a certain purpose, and the board approved it. So anyways.
Okay, and then if you wouldn't mind going back to BB 14, I believe. So we had a question here that, Dusty, you indicated that if the school bought land / a building, then it would go here. But because of the way a budget work, really it should be, you would put the money here and then purchase the land or building. Like you would budget for it before you purchase, I think is the question.
Well, yeah, I mean, your board would have to approve it in a budget before you could go execute the purchase, right? And depending on how big it is, you probably also need clearance from SPCSA, an amendment to your charter. Katie, you could speak more about that than me, but yes, of course, you have to have it budgeted for, or if something pops up, you have to have it in a board approved budget. So maybe you present an amended budget to your board. If something comes up where all of a sudden you need to make a capital purchase and it's not in your budget, those are the things you have to take to your board and get an amended budget approved. And if it's a big enough ticket item, you might need an amendment to your charter as well. But yes, it would need to go in these schedules ahead of time.
Okay, those are all the questions in the chat. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask any other questions. Feel free to raise your hand or just take yourself off mute if you want to ask anything else.
Now we are about 2 minutes out from our scheduled end time. Do we want to stay on to finish walking through these sheets, or do we want to finish this at our next session on Tuesday? I'm open to stay on, but I don't know if anybody else has preferences.
I'm free to stay on.
Yeah, I think if we can stay on, and if people are not available, then they can, go ahead and log off and we'll send out the recording.
Yep, perfect. Okay.
Nandini asks, Schedule 1 is still protected. Can we add the logo for the school?
Oh, I'll speak to that. When I locked this down, I had tested it that logos could still be inserted. I think at this point, we're just going to leave it locked. I apologize that you won't be able to personalize it with your logo. The main important thing is just entering your school name here. This will carry through to the rest of the sheets that are all linked to it. So I apologize at this point that my test apparently was inadequate. So I apologize that has remained locked.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to the next part, Dusty.
Okay, so real quick, let's look at Schedule CC. This was confusing. This was not part of the university charter template that we used to use for a lot of years. This schedule, and just so you guys know, I work with other, as part of the Commission on School Funding and stuff, I do a lot of work with some of the district CFOs. And so I bounce a lot of stuff off of them, talk about how they're using these worksheets and stuff. As a matter of fact, I talked to multiple district CFOs about how they use these worksheets. This Schedule CC is really only used if you're operating a separate debt service fiscal fund. If your board has approved the school to use a debt service fund. What is a debt service fund? I know we've had this question in the past. School districts use debt service funds, and really any fiscal fund matches up designated resources for that fund to uses. So sources match the uses, right? Or uses match the sources. Districts, the majority of districts have designated revenue to service their debt. They have property tax dollars, okay, that they get separate from their PCFP-based funding to service their bond debt. Or like Clark County School District, for example, they have a designated revenue stream for capital purchases separate from separate from their bonds for buildings and property. So specifically to buy buses. So those are designated revenue streams that have a specific purpose, and that purpose is to service debt. All charter schools, as far as I know, are using a combination of either local sources or their PCFP based funding, right? You get a loan, you get something, you're using your general fund revenue to pay for that debt. That does not really warrant a debt service fund. And feel free to talk to your auditor. I also consulted our auditor on this as well. That's specifically what he had told us. He's like, you guys don't operate a debt, you don't need a debt service fund because you don't have designated revenue streams to service your debt. You're using general fund dollars. So generally speaking, unless you have a very specific reason to operate a debt service fund, you should not be using this schedule. It doesn't apply. It's a district tab, and it's the reason we didn't have it before. And so that's a lot of my notes on your budget workbooks were this. Is your school operating a board approved debt service fund, or are you just calling it a debt service fund? So anyways, that's that schedule. Schedule C1 is where you would actually list your debt schedule. And this is similar. Nate did customize this to make this a little better, but this is similar to the debt schedule tab we had on the old workbook. And this is where you just list all of your debt. If you have bond debt, anything over 12 months, okay? You also list now per GASB 87, your capital leases that are longer than 12 months. So all of that gets listed here now on your debt schedule. Anything less than that, even if you have, in my opinion, if you're leasing copiers and you have a 3-year lease, but it's year to year, it's up to you if you want to put that on here. To me, that's more of an operating cost. I don't think I would put that on here, but you could if you wanted to. But this is for your long-term debt, and they're types of debt. So you got to make sure you categorize it and what fund it's going into. So again, if you're not operating a debt service fund, more than likely all your debt is operating within your general fund, Fund 100. Nate, if you would go ahead and talk about how this tab works.
Yep. I'll just do a quick overview of the mechanics of this because we had an internal question. So essentially, if you have Fund 100, whatever funds you enter here will show up as a drop down over here. So you enter Fund 100. We have a couple of those. There's a drop down here for the type of debt. And then essentially, as you add in your numbers, this is the core of what we care about. This summary up above essentially just riffed off of part of what was requested in the prior. It didn't have any structure built in for it, but really it just tallies up anything that's entered in down below. The key pieces here, as Dusty mentioned on a prior tab, principal payable and interest payable, these have to be part of the budget. These are what you anticipate will be spent this year in order to service that debt. Thoughts, questions about the mechanics? Oops.
That principal and interest total is what will go on schedule BB14A in your debt service line item 5,000. So the total of those principal and interest payments budgeted for this next year should go right there in schedule 5,000. It's just the total of them though. It's not broken out there.
Yep.
Any questions on the C schedules, CC and C1?
I have a question. So when I fill in this schedule C1, I only am putting the principal and the interest. My amortization expenses are not listed here, but if this is feeding the BB14A, my debt service expense won't match this because of that missing amortization expense. Is that correct?
So what is an amortization expense outside of principal and interest that are due, just for clarity?
That's a good question. I have an amortization bond discount, and then I have a bond premium. So those are the two things that are related to the bond expense. I can get further information from the accounting department, but that's when we do our budget, we are budgeting for that as well.
I think
so
that's
this budget schedule is only, it does not include any sort of non-cash transactions. So depreciation, amortization, this is just what you are literally paying for. So whatever bond principal and interest you're paying goes on here. Those amortization schedules are for your governmental wide accounting, and that technically isn't part of this. So whatever you're actually writing checks for goes on this schedule.
Yeah,
Understood. But
the amortization typically is composed of repayment of principal and the interest that is due for that time period while that principal is being repaid. So in theory, all of an amortization should be encompassed within your principal and interest. If you're doing some sort of weird negative amortizing, that may be an exception. We can talk more offline, but that should be contained within those two.
okay, yeah, that would make sense because otherwise I wouldn't tie up to my net income or something. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
The one exception of that, capital leases, the way they're amortized over the life of the lease or the useful life of the building or whatever it is you're leasing. We have seen some leases that might be interest only for the use for your, or some type of escalating lease where the amortization schedule won't match the payment schedule necessarily. This would be your payment schedule, not your amortized schedule, especially when it comes to capital leases, because those, as we've seen, have varied greatly amongst the schools. And so this is really your schedule of payments on your debt. So
yep,
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Then let's jump to J1, J2. These are only if you're operating an enterprise fund. So a separate board approved fiscal fund for enterprise activities. Those, I believe, are funds 600s per the NDE chart of accounts. So if your board has decided to operate a separate fund to track, again, if you're doing some type of school store or you have some type of program where you're generating revenue and your goal is to make a profit like like a private business would, then you might fill out these J1, J2 schedules. Otherwise, you shouldn't have anything in here. Some schools do have debt related to these items as well. So they will customize these schedules to make sure to capture all of that in here. Their revenue, their expenditures related to debt, and then the cash flow, which goes on schedule J2. But if you're not operating an enterprise fund, which I don't even believe was part of the old charter school template, but I did see a few schools populate this. I believe they populated it by mistake, unless your board did approve a separate fund. Then by all means, you need to populate both. You need to populate both J1 and J2, which is your cash flows from operating activities. I can tell you for this fund, districts don't flow this up to they keep this separate from their other budget, all the other funds that get captured in the other schedules. For your purposes, if you're operating a small separate enterprise fund, I would make sure those expenditures get on both that BB, I believe it was BB 10 or 11 schedule where the 3,200 enterprise funds were, enterprise expenses, and then code the revenue accordingly on the revenue tabs. But other than that, J1, J2 really shouldn't apply, I don't believe, to really any of the schools or the vast majority of them. Okay, Schedule T, transfers. Okay, again, this is where you capture your transfers, which generally only go one way. Districts sometimes will have a lot of other funds like capital funds, debt service. They might transfer money from a capital fund to a debt service fund or vice versa, things like that. For the vast majority of you, 99% of you, this transfer is going to be from your general fund over to your special funds like special education, ELL, at risk, where your revenue does not cover the full expenditures that you incur in those. So essentially you need to zero those funds out and you balance that out. You balance those deficits out by a transfer from your general fund over to those. And so this is where you capture that top half is for your general fund out. And so that top right quadrant in yellow, that's where you're going to transfer everything out of your general fund into, and you would line item it out like Fund 250 SPED, the amount that's going into it. Fund, 208 at risk, how much is going into that? And then you have a total transfers out. That total transfers out on line 30 should match on your BB 14A tab for total transfers out. And then this bottom left quadrant captures all those same special funds like 250, 208, whatever, the revenue coming into those funds from 100. So all your line items here in yellow would be 100, 100, 100, and then on the far left, you would list those funds that it's going to, 250 under special revenue funds. Those totals should match. Your transfers out should match your transfers in, and that net transfer subtotal should go on schedule BB6 on your revenue tab for total of funds transfers in. So again, we can't stress this enough. Please make sure you're getting your accurate costs in those programs. What I saw in the 387 reports from a lot of schools is schools only capturing enough expense to match the revenue they were getting. So they were only matching enough special education expense to match the state revenue or federal Part B revenue they were receiving, and leaving the rest of the expenditures in their general fund. That is incorrect. You need to capture the full extent of those programs and the full expense, and you balance it by a transfer out from your general fund. It's the only way we're going to get out of the narrative that charter schools aren't spending in those programs as much as districts, which is the narrative. And it's the only way we're going to have a chance to get equal funding in those, especially in special education. So please make sure you're capturing your funds transfers and that those match on those other schedules. And then that will end up correlating at the end of the year to the 387, 388 report for those funds transferred. Okay.
Yep. We cannot fight for funding for you that you do not record. Cool.
Okay. Schedules 31 and 32. These are new. How I understand these is this is where you're going to list subcontracts on both of these tabs. Let's start with Schedule 32, if you would, Nate.
Yep.
Schedule 32. This is where you're going to list your contracts that are taking the place of a position or department that would normally be employed by a typical district. So for example, back office service providers, EMOs, CMOs, things like that, that a district usually has in-house that you are now subcontracting out, that needs to go on this schedule. If you're using a substitute teaching staffing company, and so you don't have those positions specifically employed, you're not paying them directly, or some other type of staffing company, that would go on here. If you're contracting out speech, psych, you're using a special education company to help you, those are the types of contracts that go on here. It's my understanding that this is really a union related item to be tracked, to be able to track what's being outsourced that would normally be employed in a district. Okay. That's really what Schedule 32 is. Again, some of those are probably gray areas of what you might put here versus 31. I did my best to give feedback, but you do need to populate this. On Schedule 31, that's everything else that isn't generally employed in-house. Attorneys might be on there. And again, those are billable generally, but if you have a line item in your budget for $10,000 a year for legal, then I would put the 10,000 in here. If you have a budget in for maintenance for HVAC and you got a $10,000 or $15,000 budget in your line item, throw that HVAC in here. If you have a contractor that you're hiring to do a building improvement or build a new building or something like that, that might go on here. You might even argue your people who come do grounds maintenance, that's being outsourced a lot more. That could go on here, or you could argue it could go on Schedule 32 because most districts have their own in-house grounds people that are union positions. So that's kind of the general difference between 31 and 32. Do your best. If you don't capture all these contracts, I'll be honest, I don't know who's looking at these specifically and dissecting them, but that's the difference between Schedule 1, 31 and Schedule 32, as I understand it and as we understand it at the SBCSA. Okay, open it up to any other questions on those other schedules or anything else.
Should we jump back to Schedule 1 real fast and the modifieds, or do you want to
Oh,
do?
yes, yeah, I apologize. Thank you.
No worry. What do you want to do first? Modifieds or Schedule 1?
Let's go to the modifieds.
Okay.
So AA modified, these are just your summary tab. They summarize your revenue by fund, okay? And these cells should match your BB schedules. So your total federal sources up there on line 15. If you're running a separate federal fund that your board has approved, let's say fund, I believe it's like 280 for federal fund. If your board has authorized you to set up a separate fiscal fund for federal funds, then you would bring that down, insert a line 280 down below 250 where we have special education. Line like, let's say 23, 24, 25, that's where you could list any other special funds and you would put your total revenues there. If your federal dollars are staying in your general fund, or if they're going to special education, if it's Part B money, then you would make sure it goes in your special revenue down there, 250. So this is just where you summarize those totals and then your transfers in. I know this tab is a little wonky in my opinion, but do your best to make sure that at the end of the day with transfers in, that your total revenues match what's on your BB6, your BB5 and BB6 schedules.
And just a brief note in that regard, we didn't touch on the meetings. These pale orange colors are links directly to those other sources so that you're not copying over, potentially missing something or typing erroneously. So.
Yeah. The real important part is making sure your BB schedules and all of those are accurate, and then just try to make sure this ties out as best you can. AA modified is just for expenditures. So AA is revenue, AA modified is expenditures. Again, you'll see a line item in there for contingency, your fund transfers out, your debt, and then your top half is general fund, your bottom half is all your other funds. So if there's other funds that are outside of ELL, at-risk, GATE, and special revenue, which is really special education, then you would put those on 26, 27, 28, 29. And then of course, there's an enterprise fund breakout at the end. So these are just summarizing all your other schedules and they should go on here. Okay, last Schedule 1. This should match your BB schedules. So state education, that far left box, that should match Schedule B1. For your 100, 206, 207, 208, please note that 100 will include your local SPED because local SPED is part of 100 from B1. And then these other ones are where you're going to list your other funds. So Fund 250, you're going to list your total expenditures. Now you'll notice that your state education fund is capturing your revenue, where these other two are capturing your expenditures. So you're going to capture only your state education fund revenue in that left box. That total will only match Schedule B1. It will not match your BB6 schedule. It's not total revenue. It's just total state education funds revenue. That's all the Department of Taxation wanted on this form. Don't ask me why. That's what they said. That's what they put on here. So that's the total of your state education funds, your PCFP funds. And then these two yellow boxes are your total expenditures of all funds. So you'll list your funds in that middle box, Fund 100, Fund 206, 207, 208, 250, and the total of your expenditures. And then if you are operating an enterprise fund, also known as a proprietary fund, that would go in there. That'll probably be blank for 99% of you. Nate, anything I missed? Oh, make sure at the top you say what budget it is, tentative, final. Also, you use this if you do an amended final later. So you would select which one it is.
Yep. And be sure, as indicated earlier, enter your school name here. We want to make sure that we have you clearly identified. We don't want to misunderstand anything. And then down below, this is where you will sign off as school leaders and where your board can provide their approval. Electronic signatures are accepted, recommended, encouraged where possible to save you time and effort. And then don't forget your scheduled public hearings. Most of you are already having these. They should already be on the calendar, but be sure to note those here. Over here to the right, just for reference, this is sort of the color key coding. So again, as indicated earlier, yellow tabs or yellow cells are those where you're going to be inputting data. Orange typically means it's linked from somewhere else in the workbook. And then any titles or calculations or summations typically are going to come across as gray. Another quick note, throughout the workbook, we've built in a couple of automatic checkpoints. So if you see a little red dash here, that's a good thing. If at some point, let's look for an example, if at some point you see this come out with a red number next to a check, that means that something is out of balance. So you're going to want to backtrack through that to figure out what that is. Again, please give us a call if you do have any questions that you're not able to figure out. But we're trying to build in some checkpoints to help you as you're going along. And then as you're navigating through this, just a quick note, you can use your tab key to navigate quickly to those cells that are editable, if that's helpful. Thoughts, questions?
Please double check your instructions in for where to send this. So Nate, can you recap where they're supposed to upload the final budget and who they're supposed to send it to, or Katie?
I'll defer to Katie since I'm less well-versed in Epicenter.
Yeah, I just had the Epicenter directions fixed. So you'll upload it to Epicenter and then you send it to NDE. You'll send it both directly to Amber Reed, and then there's a SID compliance email in there as well. And you send it to LCB. And I just really want to thank everybody for taking the time on this. I know this is a massive shift from both the budget documents you're used to and the processes in terms of reviewing the budgets that you're used to. We are really trying to ensure that all of the financial reporting that's happening at the SPCSA schools is accurate and is reflected in the accurate places, both at the NDE level and at the legislature in particular. And so we are hoping to really be a partner in all of this. We're all kind of learning together as we go through this, and we want to be a resource to help make this, as accurate as possible and is in alignment with the various state policies as possible. So I appreciate your patience with us and your patience in learning something new. I know this is a big shift for a lot of us, and we are here as a resource to try to make this better as much as we can.
All right, any other questions from anybody before we dismiss? Thank you all, much appreciated, and good luck. And we'll have our second session next Tuesday for any follow-up questions. As indicated earlier, we're going to be posting FAQs on the website. We'll have something up later today, and then we'll be running through that with additional questions that may come in as we formulate responses. Thank you all.
Thank you.